meetings compared to the other meetings that we have. I have thousands of meetings, literally.
And at the end of a 45-minute meeting, I've helped sick kids at the Starlights Children's Hospital, which is my chosen charity.
When you're first meeting someone, you're trying to build a connection. And with Meetings for Good, you just find the connections automatically there.
And when I actually think about what Meet Magic does and the opportunity to spend some time supporting the community of our vendors, but also being able to give back.
And when the opportunity presented itself to join Meet Magic, I jumped at it.
But these ones are different, and the reason they're different is because the vendor wants to meet with you and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is.
All of those meetings blur into one, but Meetings for Good is memorable.
It absolutely makes sense to do this, and I definitely recommend peers to engage with Meet Magic.
Yes, indeed. I also recommend peers to engage with Meet Magic. It's Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? Yeah, it's Wednesday. Hi, everyone. I'm Carl. As you know, I'm the founder of Meet Magic, which is a purpose-driven platform that lets decision makers pay it forward just by networking with some of the world's best tech companies. I think some of the things that's happened this week have really drilled home to me that any tech leader or decision maker that really says they don't have time to give back is pretty much like saying getting hired for your next job is not a priority. I've seen some commentary this week and some evidence of that, and it really is quite astounding to think that what we've built with Meet Magic is really helping them get their next job. And I can guarantee you the best hiring managers are listening to how you give back and what your impact has been up until now before deciding to hire you. So I think with Meet Magic, you just make it a little bit easier for them. So decision makers, obviously, and vendors can find each other and they can share the latest tech and latest trends and things, and they can raise money for charity. So I think even Warren Buffett advocates this type of giving back. So for those that don't know me, I'm from a council estate in Nottingham where Robin Hood and the founder of the Salvation Army, Sir William Booth, come from. So we always know what to do with other people's money and how to help. So this is the Magic Room podcast, and it's where we showcase purpose-driven leaders and change makers. And everyone's got a story, and this is basically allows me to share theirs. So each episode sort of dives into what inspired them growing up and who their mentors were and what their vision for the future is, and of course how they give back now. So today I'm very lucky to welcome Nathan Brumby. Nathan is the Chief Product and Technology Officer of Domain. Nathan, we're live.
Hello, Carl. How we finally meet.
We do. I know. So look, it's been a while, but are you in Boston?
Right at the moment, I'm sitting in a basement in Boston. Absolutely.
There's something about Boston I don't know what's going on, but my girlfriend, for her 50th birthday last month and a half ago, April, wanted to run the London Marathon. So don't ask me why, but she wanted to go and do this. And so she trained hard for it. She wants to get a certain time under 3 hours 40. She got 3 hours 35, and it's allowed her to qualify for Boston. And so guess what? We're now not drinking. We're now in full health mode, and she's training for the Boston Marathon.
So a fun fact is the start of the Boston Marathon is in a town called Hopkinton. Hopkinton is probably most famous as the global headquarters of what was EMC. So every year that I worked with EMC, we all knew the Boston Marathon was coming up because it was literally going to start at the front door of our office. And 26 miles, heading east 26 miles, obviously, was the conclusion of the marathon. So we had a lot of people in that organization that each year competed.
So you're ex EMC. I remember I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and Eamon Broderick, does that ring a bell?
My tenure at EMC goes back some time ago. So name doesn't ring a bell. The person probably most notable in Asia Pacific was a gentleman called David Webster. But I worked out of the Hopkinton office, so probably more familiar with our US and European.
Yeah, Nathan was the head of IT. I was God, I was 30. I'm 54 now. 24 years ago, and I sat with him in his office, in the EMC office in Shinjuku in Tokyo, on the 50th or 60th floor of the building, and an earthquake hit, and the building was doing this.
So, interesting and fun fact was EMC bought a business out of Australia, a service management company that had been privately held in 2008. They bought it in preference to ServiceNow, who you might know.
Yep.
I was the executive that had oversight of that acquisition. The best office in EMC anywhere in the world was that office. Within that office, what had been the CEO, which was a corner office looking over the whole of Sydney. And EMC people from everywhere in the world would somehow divert to Sydney just to have the opportunity to come in and say, this infamous, the best office, so it wasn't Joe Tucci who was the CEO. It was actually the office that I randomly appeared in Sydney, Australia. And we just had this long line of visitors coming from all over the world because they just had to see this office,
Wow, it's, I think Salesforce have taken that mantle now. That office up there is incredible. We've done a few events up there. But let's get into this. I think Domain have been a great supporter of Meet Magic. I think your old CTO, David Bolton, I think was a huge supporter of what we were doing. I think he had like 10 meetings and supported, I think, Starlight Children's Foundation back then. So Nathan, tell us a little bit about you and what your background is. And obviously you're now the Chief Products and Technology Officer at Domain, right?
I am, correct. Yeah. So I don't know, how far back do you want to go? So I think grew up in a little country town, had a wonderful childhood, right? We never locked the doors. We never locked the car. We only had 3 television channels. So, you left the house at breakfast and you turned up when the sun went down. And in the intervening period, my parents never had any idea where I was, and ended up in technology, and took a few chances. So I had an opportunity very early in my career to move to the US, where, some people probably wouldn't have done that. But to me, the vision that was always, I want to go where I believe the most innovative and best opportunities were, right? So at the time, I think I had one child who was 6 months old. I just bought a house that I then sold. Like, it was a very, big leap, and moved all the way across the world to Providence, Rhode Island initially. And that started it, right? And then you sort of get into that environment, but that's kind of where it started. As I mentioned, ended up at EMC in a roundabout way, at a really interesting time. So if you recall, back in 2008, the economy collapsed. Ironically, the week that it all fell apart was the week we were doing our planning for the next calendar year. And on the Monday, Lehman Brothers went under. They were a $10 million account for us. And we got confronted with this reality of everything that we had based our assumptions on got turned upside down. And what I mean by that is we were heavily invested in physical data center business, storage up to service management. And when the economy collapsed, all that money went away. And so the rush to virtualization, up to that point, there weren't many people supportive of cloud infrastructure at all, right? That was the tipping point. And so we found ourselves in a situation where we had to change everything. We had to completely revamp all our roadmaps. I spent 3/4 of my life sitting in front of customers, literally saying, we don't have all the answers for you. We just have to be 2 steps ahead of you. And you have to trust us, and EMC had and has a phenomenal reputation as a customer first business. And so it was just this fascinating period, and there was a lot going on with stuff we were doing with Cisco and, VMware and the BMC at the time. So it was very interesting to be sitting there. And, I share with people, I was working with Pat Gelsinger, who's now the CEO of Intel. I was working with Paul Moritz at that point in time, was running VMware. John Chambers was running. So this kid from the country sort of sitting there going, what's happened? Why I'm sitting in these meetings and sort of it's almost surreal.
Yeah.
I'm getting this this privileged view to what was some fairly momentous decisions, in terms of that real paradigm shift around infrastructure technology, right? So that was all, really interesting. And then ultimately ended up, living in Boston. And then 3 years ago, approximately, Domain reached out and, hey, would you like to come home? And, just come out of COVID.
Yeah.
That had been pretty challenging personally, and found myself in Domain, and property in Australia is completely ingrained in the DNA of every Australian. Everyone talks about property.
Yeah.
So if you're going to come back, go home and go into an industry, real estate in the context of the Australian psyche is pretty interesting, and so it's a very short version of it all, but sort of an interesting ride through living in the valley for a period of time, through to living on the East Coast, where Boston's probably the second best technology city next to the valley in terms of options and capability. And it's just been a lot of fun.
A lot of our clients come funded from Boston, I think. Netscope and those sorts of companies, cybersecurity companies, have all their VCs, I think, are in Boston. But what a crazy journey you've been on. I mean, you've gone from countryside to city with John Chambers. I mean, these names for me, I've been in tech for 20 odd years, so I was in telco. So we went I watched it going from frame relay to ATM to MPLS to virtualization to SD-WAN and what it is today. And so you've gone through that same sort of thing with it. Did you remember Joe Signorelli at EMC? Does that ring a bell?
No, it doesn't. The time I was there, I worked for a guy called Chris Cahagan.
Right.
And Chris was actually the guy who took VMware as an acquisition target to EMC, which was a pretty good recommendation. It turned out to be. But that's who brought me in. Brought me into EMC was Chris, and again, it was a big step for me to walk into at that point in time, a pretty big global technology organization, deeply technical. So you were dealing with a lot of people who had a very, very strong technology backgrounds. But also, extremely good at sales execution, like, an A-grade sales force on a global base. And there was 7,000 salespeople. So, pretty sizable organization. And it was just fascinating because, you'd talk about telcos. Every telco in the world was a customer of EMC.
Yeah.
And that was Telstra, Optus, you want to talk about Australia, through to, Deutsche Telekom and BT. And so I spent probably 1/3 of my time, when you're talking about customers, in front of telcos.
Yeah, right. We probably know a lot of the same people. We probably cross paths so many ways. I mean, the Michael Harts of the world from Combank. I mean, Mike's a friend of mine now. We talk on really WhatsApp 5 times a week. But it's so one of the things I ask tech leaders when they were growing up and when they were starting out. I mean, you've gone from the countryside to literally the pinnacle. I mean, EMC was probably the dream job for most salespeople when we were in sales at that age. It literally was. If you got a job at EMC, you've made it. But what was the inspiration that you had growing up, and how did that shape how you got into tech today? What was that all about? I mean, where did that come from?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a story, but I'm happy to share it. So it goes back. So my father's father, my grandfather, tough childhood. Grew up with his maternal grandparents. They couldn't afford to send him to school, so he was 11 years old. He had to go and get a job. Incredibly clever, great engineer. 3 young children, cuts his hand off in a sawmill accident. And he's in a position, 3 young children. This is early 1950s. There's no support. Enormously motivated, absolute opposite of having a victim mentality, right? He could do anything. He could tie his shoes. He could. And imagine if you're in a world where you need to use your hands and you don't have one hand. So the best things I have in childhood was he could conceive these machines in his head and he'd build them, and what I mean by that is he would design large machines where we would go around the outskirts of Ballarat, and those machines were continuously innovative ways of finding the gold that had been left behind in the malloc heaps from the 1870s. So my childhood was hanging out with a grandfather who could weld, great with metalworking, great as a mechanical engineer. But the really sad thing is he never had that opportunity early in life, but a great builder, a great creator. Carried into my dad. My dad had a similar story. My dad never finished a full year of high school because in the middle term, he had to work with my father. So my dad could drive a truck from the age of 10. He would drive a truck to the outskirts of town. They would switch trucks. My grandfather would drive the truck with the firewood into town. But my dad, in every year of high school, only did term 1 and term 3. Right. And great builder. So when I was a little kid, my weeknights were hanging out with him in the workshop. His day job was with Esso, the oil and gas company. His second job was building bespoke kitchen cabinets that he sold all around the country. And I would go and hang out with him at night, 7 o'clock at night. And that was the second job. And so that same thing, building and creating. And then the best of the three, and I'm the worst in the whole family as an entrepreneur in terms of success. So just when you come back, I'm the by far the worst. But the best of all of them was my brother. And my brother at 11 could rebuild motorbike engines. At the age of 16, in the mid 80s, had $40,000 of cash in the bank and 50 road bikes in a garage, and was the chief mechanic for an Australian superbike team. Right. So I grew up where we didn't have a lot of money. My grandfather certainly didn't have, much money. My dad worked very hard, but there's real resiliency and want to build stuff, want to create stuff. And the theme through my grandfather, my dad, and my brother were extremely good at creating things. I was the least entrepreneurial, but I had this thing about I want to learn how to build things. But for me, building was through software. Right. So could I take that and figure out how to build things in my way that suited my skills? And that's what sort of started it all. And the turning point in it all, Carl, was at 25 years of age, my brother passed away. Left a successful business, left a whole lot of stuff there. And it was like, it was like, I'm going to get my act together and really go and try and make something out of all of this, which was a real tipping point.
I'm sorry for your loss. That's so young.
Yeah, it's he had deep vein thrombosis, so blood clot. So happens more than we realize.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, but that's if you go back, why do I want to build things? And and I think I said the other thing out of it is just enormous resiliency. Never give up.
Was there anything that really stood out that was difficult getting into it? Was there any one part of it that was like a huge challenge? I mean, I know for me, I never had a job when I left school. I left school at 15. I left home at 16. I was a father at 19. Should have been dead by the time I was 20. I left England at 25 with no skills at all, and with $300 in my pocket. My first real job was when I got to Australia in 1998 and started knocking on doors selling Optus cable television. That was that was commission only, and that was my first real job. I didn't have anything up until that point. So for me, getting into sales was very difficult because it required use of a brain, which I didn't think I had because I didn't finish school. But was there anything difficult that stood out for you getting into tech?
I wouldn't say that. I had some really good, you talk about mentors and all that, but I had some really good advice when I was early in my career. And that was, I was in an organization with a peer. That peer was significantly smarter than me. And the manager of both of us sat me down one day and said, look, you're missing something here. That person's so smart, they can think of all the right reasons to do something and they can think of all the wrong reasons to do it. And they get stuck. You're just smart enough to think about the right reasons to do it. So just keep going. And I think there's an element in that of, you got to back yourself. And you just got to have some courage, right? Like if you want to go do something, go do it. And wherever that lands you, I mean, I could have first moved to the US, flopped, and gone back 6 months later, incredibly probably embarrassed. But that's not the way that I think about things.
Yeah.
I'm going to go do it, and what happens, happens. And so I think one of the challenges in Australia, and I say that on reflection, spending a lot of my life living in the US, we're far too conservative. And in fact, I was 6 months into Domain. I was sitting with a number of the board, and they said, give us your first impressions that you're now back in the country, right? And this is really interesting, right? In the US, when you want to do something, the stock response is why not? Why not do it? In Australia, the stock response is why. It's that simple, but it's massively different in culture. And so our conservatism in Australia is why we have a great banking environment, right? The regulatory and compliance environment of that is fantastic. But in other areas, it sort of limits us.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally agree.
Yeah, and that to me is the why not is as simple as I can articulate it, is the difference spending, 20 years in tech in the US and then coming up to Australia.
There is a big difference we see. I mean, I know the American tech leaders that we talk to typically say yes or no very quickly, whereas in Australia they seem to say they'll think about it and drag it on for months and months and months, and then make a decision and say no. It seems a lot harder to get startup off the ground in this country, I think, than anywhere else on the planet. Maybe that's something to do with the fact that there's only 25 million people in the country, and the fact that it's so much more competitive.
Yeah, but the counter to that is Israel. So I've worked with US VCs for 25 years. I've helped Australian companies raise capital. I've taken companies to the US and raised capital. I was talking to VCs about Australia early 2000s. The conservatism, the fear of failure, not just the fear of failure of the founders, but the ramification of that, of the perception of that failure by who sits around them. Are they going to is so?
Yeah.
It makes it really hard. And if you're a senior executive in Australia, the appetite to go jump into an early stage startup is not the same as the US, because the perception is if it fails, the impact to you is going to be quite negative. And then again, look at Israel. I don't know what the population of Israel is. I'm pretty sure it's less than 25 million. But the level of innovation, the level of people coming out of that and have come out of that over the last 20, 25 years is incredible.
Yeah.
Right. But they're more willing to take risk. They've got an entire ecosystem sitting around them that supports innovation and risk. I think in Australia, again, I come back, I think it's cultural. I think we're incredibly conservative, which works in some industries to our benefit, and in other industries to our detriment. And the thing I think is interesting is we always point to the exceptions. We'll point to an Atlassian, we'll point to a Canva, we'll say, look at those, but they're in the minority.
Yeah.
And I think it said, come back to it, it's cultural.
I think raising capital in this country is very difficult. I think what you're saying to your point around being conservative is a lot of the investment, or a lot of the funds that the VCs raise come from superannuation. So that's really risk averse. Mum and dad's retirement money. Then they're hardly going to put that into an early stage startup that has a great chance of failure. So I think that's where the challenge comes from. So there's a lot less money floating around for early stage ideas, and this is, I think, half the battle. If that money is all superannuation backed, they're not going to put money into it unless you've got 3 or 4 years worth of traction and 100 million in revenue in the door already, and it's a sure bet.
But it's got a lot better. There's Employment Hero have done a big raise, I believe. Deputy did I think the biggest A or B round in Australia. We always point to Atlassian, and there's Canva. I think Safety Culture's done. Like, there are many more examples now. 20 years ago, it was many orders of magnitude more challenging. And those companies I've mentioned have tipped the confidence further in the right direction of, you've got VCs now saying, is there another canvas sitting in Australia, right? And so, in the last, I say 10 years, they've traveled to Australia more. They're more aware of what's happening in Australia around innovation. And here's one of the fascinating things. We're incredibly good and resourceful at creating things with very limited resource and funding. When I was at EMC, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm generalizing, but to give you a concept, we wanted to go and build an MVP or something. And this isn't factual, but just to give you the idea of it, we'd say, oh, we'll look in the US team, and they say, hey, we'll need 100 engineers for that. Through the acquisition we did in 2008, we had 150 people in North Sydney. We'd go to that team and say, we want to do, we'll do it with 10 engineers. And we could fast build prototypes, and we could fast build to MVP, because the mindset in Australia was very, very creative and resourceful by not having a lot of resources. So you could get stuff done with a lot less people, because that was just the normal mindset of that group. So, there's a lot of positive in how to be efficient in utilization of capital and resources. We just quite don't have enough of the confidence sitting behind that to have more people want to be entrepreneurs.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a guy called Patrick, I think, who set up a competitor to Domain and car sales, and a number of Patrick Grove, I think his name is, Aussie guy. He literally took the best companies out of Australia, like Domain and carsales.com.au, and he made an Asian version of them. They're flying in America, in Asia. I mean, he bought a house on the point down here in Darling Point for 35 million, and that was just the land. So he's obviously doing okay. How does Domain think about competition? Because it's obviously a competitive space.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because I think you sort of want to start with the job that you have if you're a product organization is, how do you best spend money to derive the most value for your customers or in market? Like, that's the question. And then what you really want to do is you have two choices. One, you can fast follow. And there's many examples of that, Google, 21st entrant to the search engine market, right? That's factually correct. They just happened to do better than the 20 before them. And the 20 before them were guys like Ask Jeeves, if you can recall all these.
Yeah.
Right. Lycos, etc. So that's a very, very credible way of doing it. The other way is you go, no, we want to reimagine a market, or we want to reimagine a set of experiences. And so what we want to do is, we don't want to fast follow. We kind of want to predetermine our own, where we think value sits in market that we can get to. So in Domain, categorically, we're not fast following. Now, equally, there is the reality that our the largest competitor is a few times bigger than us. And so you could say, where's the rationale in winning in trying to win in a fair fight? Whether, in relative terms, we're smaller. So then you got to change the game. So, Sun Tzu, right? Don't like the battlefield, change the battlefield.
Yeah.
So the way we think about it is, we talk a lot in market publicly about a marketplace. And what we mean by that is, if you have a look today, what's emerging is not transactional environments, but environments where there is persistent and intelligent interaction, right? And so I'll give a real example, because I think this is fascinating, is Amazon Marketplace. Now in the US, sells, finances, delivers Volvo cars. So Volvo has abdicated that direct to consumer experience to a marketplace, because it's a more efficient transaction. By the way, Salesforce is in Amazon Marketplace now too.
Yeah, right.
You go back 10 years ago, I don't think Mark Benioff ever would have contemplated that happening. Why does it happen? Because Amazon has absolutely optimized an experience on a persistent basis with a user. Right. So whether or not it's Facebook Marketplace, equally valid, Amazon Marketplace, what you're seeing now, the dynamic that's changing, is if you have a look at consumers incredibly intolerant of bad experiences, incredibly impatient, right? Very selective of where they dedicate their time because there's so many options. And so you're seeing this shift. And this is going to just continue on. And it's really, really starting to optimize. It's trying to take all the lost money out of how do I monetize a good or service to you? And this goes back to Volvo. The biggest automotive market in the world, the most lucrative, is the US market by far. I would have bet money 10 years ago, every manufacturer in the US would have bet everything that they would never abdicate that direct experience to a consumer. Now that's changed.
It really has. You remind me of a phrase. So Rory Sutherland, who arguably is probably the number one ad man on the planet, he's the vice chairman of Ogilvy in the UK. He's a Meat Magic shareholder and also my chief evangelist. So I actually reached out to Cliff at Canva and I said to Cliff, how did you get your chief evangelist on board? I said, give me some tips. And so Cliff gave me some tips and hey, presto, I managed to get Rory to come and sign up. But one of the things that Rory says very, 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 very well is that a rational leader suggests changing course to avoid a storm, whereas an irrational one can change the weather. And I think that's what Benioff is doing, and that's what Bezos is doing as well. And there's quite a lot of, you don't get to become companies like that without delivering a world-class experience, and that ultimately is, I think, what they've done really, really well.
Absolutely. And then all they're doing now is finding more ways to monetize that machine. I mean, the big one in the US now with Amazon is pharmaceutical. So you can't go more than an hour without seeing a television ad here about that. You should go to Amazon for your prescription medicine.
Oh, wow.
Now, would that have been conceivable 5 years ago? I would argue no. Right. But their advertising now has come to us. We're cheaper. You get it in 2 hours. How are you going to beat that?
Wow. You can't. Literally 2 hours. Wow. Is that what it's down to now?
Amazon is 2-hour delivery.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. I mean,
but again, what are they optimizing? The supply chain, the delivery capability, the processing of that. If there's a benefit from the government, like they've built the machine. Again, they're just finding ultimate ways to merchandise that in a very personalized way to a market.
Yeah, we've got some work to do on it. It's really quite exciting, I think, where it's come from and where it's going. I'm 54 now, and we're very lucky to have grown up in the 80s and the 90s and to watch tech evolve from nothing to what it is today. From playing outside and when you only knew it was time to go home was when the street lights came on, so it was pretty normal for us to not have it. That was it. But today, where it is and where it's going to be in the next 20 years is going to be changed all again. And you've got to think that there's not one thing you can do to predict how it's going to end up in the next 10 or 15 years. And I sort of wonder what kind of advice you'd give to anybody that wants to get into tech today, because it's changing so fast. So it's not like when we were there.
But I think before I give the advice, I mean, this is the magic of it, right? It's changing so fast that things that were not conceivable 5 or 10 years ago are not only conceivable now. You can access them, you can use them. And that's the magic of being in an industry like this, right? There's so much opportunity and that to do things that are fundamentally changing how we live our lives. So that's it. In terms of, to your question of what advice, to the younger about getting in, I think 2 things. One is I do quite a bit of mentoring, and that mentoring is actively and consciously think about your career. So where do you want to be in 3 years' time, and what are you actually going to do to get there? Or where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And to be candid, 98% of people don't do that. And what I mean by that is they don't really deeply think about where they are, and if they want to get to that next thing, what does that actually mean, and how do you get there? Yeah, so there's an element that you really do have to be strategic, right? And then I think the second thing is just you got to back yourself. Like the worst, and this goes back to fear of failure. This goes back to the conservatism in Australia is what is the worst thing that happens if you take a shot at something that doesn't work out?
Yeah.
And if you're good at having an ability, we talk about risk, right? There is risk that you don't calculate, which is bad risk. And there's risk that you calculate, which you can live with. What risk can be calculated? So if you want to make a career change, if you're really honest with yourself about what the level of that risk is, what's the upside, what's the downside, probably 9 times out of 10, you're going to do what you should. If you're really honest with yourself, and that's a great opportunity, you're going to take the opportunity. But again, that means you've really got to be honest with yourself, and you really got to think about what do you want. And so this goes back into all the mentoring. I speak to people who are middle stage of their career, right? They're either going to keep challenging themselves and finding ways to develop their career, or they're going to kind of reach a ceiling point because they've stopped actively doing that management of their career. Because again, no one else is going to do it for you.
Yeah.
No one, right? Only you know inherently within yourself where you're at and what you want. And the other advice I've taken, and I stand by it, I've never taken a job for money, and I've never made money the number one thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's a byproduct of and I'm honest with myself, I get bored really easy. So if I'm going to go do something, they're going to pay, but in 6 months' time, I'm going to be banging my head against the wall. I'll quit. I don't care how much money you pay me, right? So you really, but again, that requires in the level of self inspection, what motivates you, what are the principles by which you're making these decisions, and then what's important to you in terms of where you want to go. And then the last thing in all of that is be happy. Doesn't matter how long any of us have, it's not long enough. And I've again mentored a lot of people, which honestly, they're just unhappy because they're not making decisions for the right reasons. They made it for money, or they made it because there was a prestige of a title, or they made it because there was a prestige of a company. I'm working for company X, big deal.
Yeah.
Right? Big deal.
Do you think the circumstances of our lives actually matter less to our happiness than the sense of control that we feel over it?
Well, control is interesting, right? Because what do you actually control? You don't really control anything.
Yeah.
You have the ability to do what you can do today. Yesterday's done, tomorrow. Who cares, right? I mean, I know I'm saying you should plan out. I agree. But there's a wonderful statement in Tibetan Buddhism, which is the impermanency of life.
Yeah.
And that's a reality, right? So I think, look, it's fascinating to me. 25 years ago, we never talked about burnout. We never talked about people being stressed to the way we do today. There's a whole lot of conversations we have today where there's a realization that decisions can be made that are good for you and decisions that can be made that are really bad for you. And there's just a lot more openness to talk about that. And there's a lot more acknowledgement of, again, things like burnout, things like stress, things like I've made some bad decisions in my life. Career is, so it is interesting. But yeah, be happy.
It's a really. I'm a father. I've got 2 kids. One of them's 34. He's in the UK, living a very poor life because that's where we started. He's still there, hasn't got out. He's actually a groundsman at Trent Bridge Cricket Club. He thinks he's from the Channel because he's cutting grass. He's happy as Larry because he's got a job. My daughter's 21 here at uni in Queensland, and she's doing a double degree in business and communications and having living a completely different life to her brother, which is remarkable. But the advice I give to both of them is to try and be good at 2 things, not one, and if possible, make them overlap a little bit because it might help you in the future. But that's really interesting. There's some amazing thoughts you've just given in there. I think that's being happy is really part of the kit. You've only got 4,000 lives. What is it? 900 months is the average life. 80 years. I'm 54. I've had 640 of those 900 already. There's not that many left. So what are you scared of, and what are you waiting for? Is always a thing in my brain. Just go and have a go, because you don't know how long you've got on this planet, and why wait?
Exactly. Why wait?
So you've how do you give? I mean, you mentioned the mentoring stuff that you do. Is there any other ways that you give back? I mean, mentoring is great.
Yeah. So the other way is probably a bit left field is licensed foster parent for at-risk children. So children when they're immediately pulled out of a bad situation, up until they go to court, which is 2 business days later. And then, when they go to court, they can go back to the parents, they can go to next of kin, they can stay in care. So that's been that was the last 5 years in Boston. And just fascinating because it's a 6-month program to become a licensed foster parent in Massachusetts. And the thing that was shocking is, as an example, we live, speaking about myself, very privileged life. We're quite oblivious to the level of sex trafficking that actually happens in reality, and the level of substance abuse, particularly fentanyl, and what that has done in terms of the number of children. And I mean, children starting at 1 week old, that are in just terrible situations. And it's really, again, you can live a very privileged life and be oblivious to this, and then you go do something like this 6 months of training, and you get a real sort of different view about what's happening. And I know that when we did the training, there was 9,500 children in Massachusetts under the age of 7 at risk in this type of situation. And again, they're coming out where parents are threatening each other, parents are heavily addicted on drugs, alcohol. But that's a really interesting one for me, right? In the sense that, every child sort of has the right to start life, not one step behind.
It's actually a big problem in Australia. I think, Hugh Jackman's ex-wife has a charity here called Adopt Change. And the problem with the Australian adoption system is really bad. There's 45 or 50,000 kids under the age of 18 in this country that just get bounced from pillar to post, and they've had up to 18 homes by the time they get. Up to 11 homes by the time they get to 18, and then the government says, "Right, you're on your own now," and you wonder why these kids are just moving in the wrong circles and ending up homeless. It's just incredible.
But we also, a whole different conversation, we don't really celebrate the right people. So, when we were doing the training, we had an individual come in who was in his 50s, single male in his 50s, who only took terminally ill children, and basically was the caregiver through to them passing away.
Wow.
And you just had a revolving door of children, right? And did it with just complete love and compassion. But how many times could you take a child in, care for them, protect them, look after them, and know it's getting terminal, and then go take the next one? So we don't celebrate those people. We don't really give them a lot of acknowledgement. But that person, I mean, just the emotional toll to do that. And by the way, this might be a 7-year-old child who's got terminal cancer, who's never had parents, whose only love and security will be with this gentleman for a finite period of time. It's the only love they'll know. It's the only time they'll feel safe. So we really, really don't. We talk about giving back, but sometimes it's just as simple as we have people out in the community that are doing things like that, completely selfless, with enormous hearts. I mean, I don't think I could do what that person. I don't believe I could do what that person was doing.
That's almost brought me to tears. I can feel the tears at the back of my head, thinking. I mean, I did that. I did that with a dog. You take a dog off death row, and the dog was 10. Thinking, to do that with a human, that's a whole nother level.
Yeah, and to your point, right? Like that's the sort of when you talk about community, that's the sort of thing we should be talking about. And those examples, they're the people we actually should be celebrating. But those people, in their nature and why they do that, is why they'll never look for recognition. they don't do it for any other thing than they're just incredibly kind human beings that are true to their nature.
Do you know, Nathan, it's one of the things that annoys me most is people that seek the attention for it. I get 3 invitations a week from people asking me to submit a request or submit an application for an awards ceremony of some kind, you know, whether it's this and that. And then I go through the application and then realize they want to take $5,000 off me for the application, and I might get a seat at the table for the black tie function. And for me, what I've done with Meet Magic is absolutely nothing about awards. I don't need that. I set this thing up to donate $250 million to charity to make as much impact as I can. I've given 98% of my wealth away. I own no house. I've got a 10-year-old car. I'm renting here. All the money that comes into this business, 90% of it goes back into growing and supporting charities around the world. And it's the same thing. It's like, we don't need awards. You're doing it out of there's a purpose behind it. And I think that purpose is what makes you feel like you don't need sleep. It's inspiration. It's everything that comes from within. It's really quite remarkable. Somebody asked me what the difference was between inspiration and motivation, and it's very different. You know, you need to be motivated to get up to go to work in the morning, and that's why you have the snooze on your clock. You hit that because you can't be bothered to get up. But when you've got inspiration, it's coming from your spirit. You don't need any alarm clock anymore. You just get up and get stuff done. I have to force myself to go to bed at night because I could work 24 hours a day because it doesn't feel like work. It's so inspiring to do what we're doing. But that is that's an incredible journey. I think there's a lot of people that could learn a lot from that guy.
There's a great saying, right? And I firmly believe this, and I got told this many years ago. You got to live in the world, but not of the world.
Yeah, I love that.
It's that simple.
I love that. This has been a really nice conversation, Nathan. I want to ask you one last question. If I gave you $200,000, how would you invest it?
The first reaction has got no idea. Is the honest answer. You probably say, well, I should say property, right? Given domain. I say no idea quite sincerely, and that's because in part, I guess, because I've lived my life going back to the live for the day. So my financial planner's worst nightmare, because I just, you want to talk about when I'm 80. I don't know if I'm going to get to 80, right? So nice thing. I don't know. I mean, we've just talked a lot about. The question, I guess, would be with $200,000, if you want to do it in a way that was good for the community and for goodwill, what would be the most impactful way to do it? And I think that's a tough question to answer, right? Because going back, there's got to be a lot of structural change, I think, if we truly want to change as a society how we look after and care for people.
Yeah.
And it would be a massive, massive change.
Yeah.
And so the challenge I have, to your point, with a lot of charities, is I just don't think they're as effective as they could be, because I think structurally they're not optimized to fulfill what probably is their stated mission. So, I look, $200,000 is going back to it. I'd love to see a capability where you take that individual I just shared who's looking after terminally ill kids and find ways to better support him looking after terminally ill kids, because he's not getting any support. Financial, really? He's getting minimal financial support as a foster parent, but you don't go and be a foster parent for the money.
No,
there's not enough money there, right? So, I mean, if you want to have it, $200,000, figure out a way, again, to structurally change how you look after your most at risk, and to me, the most at risk are children who don't have a mum and dad.
Really powerful, and I think there's something to be said about that, because it's you can empower people. When my daughter was 11, 12, and 13, she'd get the train from town hall to Strathfield, and every 2 weeks I'd give her $50, and I'd say, this $50 is not for you and your girlies to go and buy you iced lattes. This is for you to give to somebody to make their world a little bit better. And I don't care how you made them feel. I want you to come back and tell me how it made you feel.
Mhm.
And this is something I learned from a guy called Rob Kaludis, who does this with his staff. Rob is CEO of his own trading company called, he was actually the founder of Optiva, and then he's got one called VivCourt Trading now, so he gives all of his staff, and he's got a couple of hundred of them, $10,000 unattached every year. And so he says to them, here's your $10,000, go and change someone's life. And you have no idea the impact that $10,000 can have on one person. And I think, to your point, this is exactly what needs to happen. It's the charities I'm seeing the charities. There's a lot of, apart from the fact there are 68,000 of them in this country, and there's one for every 400 Australians, and 93% of their funds are coming from mum and dad. Something needs to change, because it's kind of, I think the charity system is kind of broken here. They're doing a lot of great work, but I think the way they're going about it needs to be some structural change.
But you question if they are, because if there's 68,000 charities representing X, how many $100 or billion?
Yeah.
Why do we still have 50,000 at-risk kids under the age of 18?
Right.
Like, so something's not, working effectively enough. And whether or not I just say at risk, right? People that are at risk. Let's not even talk about children.
Yeah.
But it's not for a lack of charities. If there's 68,000, it's probably not for a lack of money, because I'm guessing that represents, again, I said, probably billions of dollars.
Mm.
Yet we still have a significant amount of people that don't have a reasonable chance at life.
It's really sad, when it is an industry, and I'll call PwC out on this, because I've called them out in the past. When you get the likes of PwC talking about a workforce optimization strategy for the homeless industry, you've got to question what the hell that's all about, because you're meant to end homelessness, not perpetuate it. And keeping people in jobs is not something you want. You want to end those jobs and get people off the streets. We've raised hundreds of millions of dollars for homelessness through the CEO Sleep Out, yet there are more people sleeping on the streets than ever before. I get it. It's something definitely needs to change. But Nathan, we can talk about this all day. I just want to say thank you for coming on and for giving me your time. So I know I chased you quite a bit, and this is our hardest part is getting through to people today. It's because time is kind of interesting. We're about to do an event in the UK at the Salesforce Tower, and we're going to have the prison minister hopefully coming along, the head of the prison reform group, who's Nick Stace, who's also one of the heads of Barclays in the UK, head of ESG for Barclays. I've got Raphael Rowe, who's helping. Obviously, Raphael Rowe's got a foundation to help. And Rory, my chief evangelist, we're going to get them all together to talk about time, because the one thing you have in prison is time, but the one thing you don't have when you're out of prison is time, and it's what we do with it that really makes the difference. And you giving me 45 minutes of yours today has made a bit of a difference to me. So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me, and enjoyed the conversation. Enjoyed learning a little bit more about you and what's driving and motivating you. So thank you for sharing that. And appreciate the chance to come on and have a chat. So thank you.
We're going to be Salesforce. We're about to do a little bit of business with Salesforce. One of the ideas that we've got is to really empower prisoners to learn the Salesforce trade. Because there's a shortage of Salesforce engineers out there. So if you're in prison for 10 years, why not just go to school every day and learn a little bit about how to implement Salesforce? You come out and you'll have a job. It could make a difference. So I'm thinking Benioff might like that. But one of the things we're going to do is, I think Boston has a Salesforce tower, doesn't it?
I don't know. I've been in the one in San Fran. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in the one in Sydney, which is a beautiful building. As you said, we're actually there where we had a chance during Vivid. So, the view from that Salesforce office with Vivid going was just fantastic, right?
Yeah.
So Boston, I honestly don't know if there's one here.
I flew Raphael Rowe over to speak at the event, and we had it at Salesforce Tower during Vivid in May. It was ridiculous. You're right. We had a couple hundred people turn up.
Yeah.
And it was just remarkable. But Have a cracking evening, Nathan. Thank you so much for your support, and you know, I look forward to chatting with you again. And hopefully, if my other half gets her stuff together for Boston Marathon, we'll come and say hello.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.